What did Thanksgiving look like when you were dirt poor? Not everyone had a golden turkey on the table. In this video, I'll show you 10 real poor man's Thanksgiving meals, the kind families made when they had more love than money. And maybe you'll even recognize a few, because in hard times, people didn't stop giving thanks. They just cooked what they had. Onion gravy over bread. During the Great Depression, when money was tight and food even tighter, onions were one of the few ingredients almost every family could afford. They were cheap, they lasted through the winter, and when slowly browned in a cast iron skillet, they filled the whole house with the smell of comfort. If you had bacon grease or lard, you'd add it in. A spoon of flour, some water, maybe a dash of salt, and just like that, you had onion gravy. People poured it over stale homemade bread, tore it with their hands and called it Thanksgiving. No turkey, no pie, just hot gravy, soft bread, and one more reason to be thankful. Vinegar pie. It sounds strange now, but back then, they called it desperation pie. During the Great Depression, sugar was expensive, and fresh fruit? That was for the lucky few. So home cooks got creative. They used vinegar, just a spoon or two, to mimic the tang of lemons or apples. Mixed with flour, sugar, water, and a homemade crust, it became a warm, wobbly pie that tasted like hope. It wasn't sweet like modern desserts, but when you hadn't had pie in months, even vinegar tasted like a blessing. Mashed turnips instead of potatoes. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a luxury. Families saved them for baking or stretching into soups. So on Thanksgiving, many poor households turned to turnips instead. Turnips were cheap, easy to grow, and kept well in a root cellar through the winter. Boiled, mashed with a little butter or lard, if you had it, they became a stand-in for creamy mashed potatoes. They were sharper, more bitter, but they filled bellies. And for families with nothing else, a bowl of mashed turnips still felt like Thanksgiving. 4. Mock turkey, the Frankenstein bird. Not every poor family could afford a turkey. In fact, for many during the Depression, wartime rationing of the 1940s, or the inflation years of the 1970s, a real Thanksgiving turkey was out of reach. But some families found a clever solution. They made what was called a mock turkey. Leftover chicken, bits of ham, bread stuffing, even ground meat, all pressed together into the shape of a bird. Sometimes they stitched it inside chicken skin or wrapped it in fat, roasting it so that on the table it looked like a whole turkey. Of course, it wasn't the real thing. The slices weren't neat, the taste wasn't rich. But to children at the table, it looked like a feast. For a few brief hours on Thanksgiving, imagination filled the gap that money couldn't. And sometimes that was enough. 5. Giblet gravy and neck stew, 1930s to 1970s. For poor families, the most valuable parts of a bird weren't the breast or the legs. They were the scraps no one else wanted. Giblets, the liver, heart, gizzard, and neck, became the centerpiece of many Thanksgivings. In the 1930s Depression years, nothing was thrown away. Those small, tough pieces were simmered for hours, turning into a thin stew or a rich brown gravy poured over bread. In the 1940s, during wartime rationing, families were often given only the extra parts at butcher shops. But even then, mothers turned them into a holiday dish. By the 1970s, when inflation made meat expensive, giblet gravy still showed up on poor families' tables. A reminder that even the humblest scraps could be transformed into something worth sharing. It wasn't the feast of the wealthy, but when that steaming pot was set down in the center of the table, it smelled like Thanksgiving. 6. Mock pumpkin pie. Pumpkin pie was the symbol of Thanksgiving, but real pumpkins weren't always easy to find, and for many families they were simply too expensive. During the 1940s, when World War II rationing limited sugar, milk, and even transportation, home cooks learned to improvise. Instead of pumpkin, they mashed squash, sweet potatoes, or even carrots, spicing them with cinnamon or nutmeg if those were in the pantry. In the 1970s, when grocery prices soared during the inflation crisis, mock pumpkin pie returned once again. Housewives flipped through church cookbooks and Depression-era recipes, looking for ways to put pie on the table without spending too much. It didn't taste exactly like pumpkin. The texture was thinner, the sweetness uneven, but it looked like tradition. For children, it was still pie. And for poor families, one slice of mock pumpkin pie meant Thanksgiving could end with something sweet, even if it wasn't the real thing. 7. Cabbage slaw instead of salad. A fresh green salad on Thanksgiving? For poor families, that was impossible. Lettuce wilted quickly, spinach was seasonal, and anything fresh from the store cost too much. But cabbage was different. It was cheap, it was sturdy, and it lasted for weeks in a cool pantry or cellar. So on Thanksgiving Day, mothers shredded cabbage by hand, splashed it with vinegar, a spoon of sugar, and a pinch of salt. If there were carrots, they added color. Most of the time, it was just plain white cabbage in a chipped enamel bowl. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, this simple slaw was often the only fresh thing on the table. In the rationing years of the 1940s, it became a reliable side dish again. And by the 1970s, when inflation pushed grocery bills higher and higher, cabbage slaw remained a poor man's answer to salad. It was sharp. It was crisp. It cut through the heaviness of beans, bread, and gravy. Humble as it was, it gave the holiday table a splash of freshness, and that made it special. 8. Ham, hock, and beans, 1940s to 1960s. For poor families, the centerpiece was sometimes nothing more than a pot of beans flavored with a single ham hock. A ham hock is the lower part of a pig's leg, too tough and fatty for the wealthy, but cheap enough for the poor. In the 1940s, during wartime rationing, families bought them for pennies using the scraps to flavor dried beans. By the 1950s and well into the 1960s, this dish remained common in poor rural communities, especially in the South and in Appalachia. Families with no access to expensive cuts of meat relied on ham hocks to make beans taste hearty and festive. It was an unusual Thanksgiving dinner. No bird, no roast, no centerpiece, just beans and bone. But for the families who ate it, the warmth of that pot was enough to gather around and give thanks. 9. Bread pudding from stale loaves. In poor households, bread was never wasted. During the Depression years of the 1930s, and even into the 1950s in small towns, stale bread became the base of a Thanksgiving dessert. Mothers tore old loaves into rough pieces, the sound of crust cracking filling the quiet kitchen. Those scraps were soaked in warm milk, sweetened with sugar or, more often, thick black molasses. Slowly the hard bread softened, turning into something new. If raisins could be found, they were sprinkled in like tiny treasures. A pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg filled the whole house with a smell that made children smile before the dish even left the oven. For many, this humble pudding was the sweetest part of Thanksgiving. No pies, no cakes, just scraps reborn as dessert. Families called it poor man's pudding. Simple, warm, comforting, proof that even the most ordinary leftovers could be transformed into something worth celebrating. 10. Potato cakes from leftovers, 1960s to 1980s. The day after Thanksgiving, poor families made sure nothing went to waste. In the 1960s and even well into the 1980s in struggling households, leftovers weren't just reheated, they were transformed. Mashed potatoes from the holiday table were mixed with chopped onions, a spoon of flour, maybe an egg if one was left in the pantry. The mixture was patted into small cakes, dropped into a hot skillet, and fried until the edges hissed and crackled. Crisp and golden on the outside, soft and steamy inside. These potato cakes were served for breakfast, lunch, or supper. Children loved them, sometimes more than the feast itself, because they were salty, crunchy, and eaten straight from the pan. In poor families, this was how Thanksgiving carried on. One skillet at a time, a second chance for scraps to shine. Simple, frugal, delicious. Proof that even the humblest leftovers could feel like a celebration. And before we finish, here's a little bonus recipe you can actually try this year. Bonus recipe, Depression-era apple crisp. During the Depression, many families couldn't afford pie crusts, so instead, they baked a simple apple crisp. Just sliced apples, sprinkled with sugar, covered in a rough topping of flour, butter, or lard, and baked until golden. It was quick, cheap, and filled the whole house with the smell of Thanksgiving. If you want to taste a piece of history yourself, make this Depression-era apple crisp for your family. A poor man's dessert, that still tastes just as good today.